take a deep breath and let the day begin to fade. You're safe, you're here, and you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we'll gently drift back through time, across oceans and borders, to explore one of the most defining chapters in human history, World War II. But don't worry, there's no rush, no urgency. Just a slow, steady journey, guided by quiet narration, thoughtful storytelling, and a pace that lets your mind settle. This isn't about battles or noise. It's about understanding how the world unraveled and how somehow it found its way back. So close your eyes, get comfortable, and allow the story to unfold. One chapter at a time. Let's begin. The world before the war. The world had not truly healed after the Great War. The armistice of 1918 had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the pain, the bitterness, or the hunger that lingered in millions of homes across Europe and beyond. Soldiers had returned to countries they barely recognized, places marked by ruined cities, broken economies, and fractured identities. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to be the foundation of a new peace, a lasting order born from the ashes of empire and bloodshed. But it carried within it the seeds of resentment. Rather than healing the wounds of war, it salted them. Germany, once the proud and industrially powerful heart of Central Europe, had been brought low. Its Kaiser gone, its army disarmed, and its people burdened with crushing reparations. Millions of Germans, stripped of dignity and hope, faced hyperinflation so severe that savings vanished overnight, and money was used more effectively as kindling than currency. Families carried baskets of notes just to buy bread. Veterans begged in the streets. Children went hungry. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile new democracy, struggled to govern a land divided by trauma and ideology. From all sides came accusations of betrayal, of conspiracy, of weakness. It was in this chaos that extremism began to take root. Some yearned for the return of the monarchy, others embraced communism, but a growing number were drawn to a new force, nationalism reforged into something darker. The Nazi Party, a fringe movement led by an embittered former soldier named Adolf Hitler, promised order, purpose, and restoration. He blamed the Jews, the communists, the foreign powers. He promised strength and pride, and people, desperate for something, anything to believe in, began to listen. But the storm gathering over Europe was not confined to Germany alone. Italy, a victor of the First World War, had gained little from its sacrifices. The people were disillusioned. Political factions tore at each other. Into this turmoil stepped Benito Mussolini, who offered a new idea: fascism. It was built on power, discipline, and control. In 1922, he marched on Rome and was granted leadership without a shot fired. Under his rule, democracy was dismantled. Critics disappeared. The trains ran on time, they said, but freedom vanished in the process. Mussolini's Italy became the first modern fascist state, and it would not be the last. The 1920s were a brief, illusory breath of recovery. In places like Paris, Berlin, and New York, the Roaring Twenties brought jazz, cinema, and the illusion of a world moving forward. But underneath the glamour, cracks widened. Then, in 1929, the global economy collapsed. The Great Depression was not just a downturn, it was a catastrophe that rippled across oceans. Banks failed, unemployment soared, desperation deepened. In Germany, already on the brink, the crisis became unbearable. Democracy, already viewed by many as ineffective, now looked like a luxury the suffering could no longer afford. By 1933, Hitler had been appointed chancellor. Many thought they could control him, that he would be tamed by the responsibilities of office. But within months, he had dismantled the very institutions meant to constrain him. The Reichstag burned. Civil liberties were suspended. The Nazi regime seized total control. Dissenters were silenced. The Gestapo listened at keyholes. Children were taught to hail the Führer. Books were burned in public squares. The swastika replaced the flag of the Republic. Germany was no longer a democracy. It had become a dictatorship wrapped in ceremony and fear. In the Soviet Union, another totalitarian system had taken hold. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals and consolidated absolute power. The Soviet Union pursued a brutal path of industrialization and collectivization. Farms were seized, millions starved. Political purges became routine, with show trials and executions cleansing the state of any who dared dissent. The world watched with horror and fascination as Stalin transformed the USSR into a paranoid giant, willing to sacrifice millions to achieve his vision of socialist utopia. While Europe stewed in uncertainty, Japan marched to the beat of a different drum. Long isolated, it had modernized with incredible speed. But Japan had ambitions, and its ruling military elite believed their nation was destined to lead Asia. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria, claiming it as a puppet state. The League of Nations objected, but toothlessly. Japan withdrew from the League and deepened its militaristic path. The emperor became a living god. Expansion was no longer a question of if, but when and where. In Spain, a brutal civil war erupted in 1936. On one side, the Republicans, a shaky coalition of liberals, communists, and anarchists. On the other, the nationalists, led by Franco, supported by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Spain became a battlefield for ideologies, a grim preview of what was to come. Bombs fell on cities, foreign volunteers fought and died, and the world looked on. By 1939, Franco had won. Another authoritarian regime had joined the growing list. Through all this, the Western democracies hesitated. Britain and France, haunted by the unimaginable losses of the Great War, clung desperately to peace. Their economies, too, were weakened by the Depression. Rearmament was expensive. War was unpopular. Leaders like Neville Chamberlain believed in diplomacy, in negotiation, in giving aggressors what they wanted, so long as it kept the guns silent. They called it appeasement. And at first, it seemed to work. In 1938, Hitler absorbed Austria into the Reich, in what he claimed was a unification of German people. Then came Czechoslovakia. He demanded the Sudetenland, home to many ethnic Germans. Britain and France gave in at the Munich conference. Chamberlain returned with a piece of paper and proclaimed peace in our time. But within 6 months, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. He had lied, openly and brazenly, and the world had let him. Meanwhile, inside Germany, life for many was changing rapidly. The Nazis poured resources into highways, rearmament, and spectacle. The economy recovered, but only on the surface. The cost was freedom. Jews were increasingly isolated, barred from professions, schools, and eventually, even citizenship. Anti-Semitic laws became part of daily life. Propaganda flooded newspapers, radio, and cinema. The idea of a pure German race, superior, destined to rule, was now state doctrine. Fear and fanaticism walked hand in hand. By 1939, Hitler's sights were set on Poland. He demanded the return of Danzig and access through the Polish corridor. Britain and France, finally aware that appeasement had failed, made a pledge. If Germany invaded Poland, there would be war. In the shadows, Hitler made a shocking move. He negotiated a non-aggression pact with Stalin. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned the world. Publicly, it meant peace between the two powers. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Hitler would take the West, Stalin the East. And then, in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, the sky over Poland turned black with the wings of the Luftwaffe. German tanks crossed the border. Cities were bombed. Civilians fled. Blitzkrieg had begun, not just a strategy of war, but a philosophy of overwhelming force, speed, and terror. Within weeks, Poland was shattered. The Soviet Union marched in from the east, taking its share. On September 3rd, Britain and France, bound by honor and treaty, declared war on Germany, but it was too late to save Poland. The world stood on the edge of something vast and terrible. In the east, Stalin waited and watched. In the west, armies mobilized, unsure of what would come next. Across the oceans, the United States remained distant, watching as the storm rolled in. And so, with one invasion, the world was plunged back into darkness. A second war had begun, one that would span continents, consume tens of millions of lives, and reshape humanity's understanding of evil, of courage, and of survival. The most devastating conflict in history was now underway. The war begins. The guns had spoken again, just 2 decades after they had supposedly fallen silent for good. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, the borders of Poland lit with fire and thunder. German troops surged forward with an energy and coordination that stunned observers. Planes screeched overhead, dropping bombs on cities, bridges, and railways. Tanks rolled across farmland. Infantry followed swiftly behind. This was not war as it had been remembered from the trenches of World War I. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, an overwhelming combination of speed, surprise, and force designed to crush an enemy before it could even react. Poland, though brave and defiant, was vastly outmatched. Its cavalry, though courageous, faced the steel hulls of panzer divisions. Communication lines were severed, airfields destroyed. Warsaw, the capital, came under relentless bombardment. The Polish military fought with determination, but the German advance was methodical and merciless. On September 17th, the situation grew even more desperate. The Soviet Union, honoring its secret pact with Germany, invaded from the east. Poland, already on its knees, found itself caught in a deadly pincer. There would be no rescue, no salvation. Britain and France, true to their word, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. But in truth, they were not ready. Their armies were not fully mobilized. Their people, though angry, were still shocked by how quickly war had arrived. And so, while Poland burned, the West waited. There was no immediate attack, no grand push across the border into Germany. For months, a strange quiet settled over Europe, one that felt too calm to be real. This period would come to be known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg in German, a time when war had been declared, but little seemed to be happening. Along the French border, vast defensive fortifications, the Maginot Line, stood silent and imposing, built to prevent another German invasion. French troops manned the bunkers. British soldiers, part of the British Expeditionary Force, arrived on French soil and waited for orders that never came. There were patrols, drills, moments of tension, but no major battles. The world held its breath. Inside Germany, however, there was no stillness. Hitler and his generals were preparing their next move. Poland had fallen in weeks, but the war was far from over. Hitler knew he had to break the will of the Western Allies before they could regroup. His sights turned toward Scandinavia, toward control of the iron ore shipments that fed his war machine. And so, in April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day. Its government surrendered rather than see Copenhagen reduced to rubble. Norway, more mountainous and resistant, fought longer. British and French forces attempted to intervene, landing in the port city of Narvik, but coordination was poor. German paratroopers and naval units moved swiftly. The Allies were forced to withdraw. Norway fell into German hands. With it came control of the northern coastlines and access to vital resources. Hitler's reach was expanding with alarming speed. Then, in May 1940, the storm truly broke. The world, still caught in the lull of the Phony War, watched in disbelief as Germany launched an all-out assault westward. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, neutral nations, were suddenly under attack. The speed and violence of the German advance overwhelmed defences. The Dutch surrendered within days after Rotterdam was bombed into submission. The Belgians resisted fiercely, but their cities crumbled under the Luftwaffe's wrath. The true genius of the German plan was revealed in France. The French military had expected a repeat of the First World War, a slow, grinding fight through Belgium. But Hitler's generals, particularly Erich von Manstein, had devised something audacious. The Germans sent their main force not through the flatlands of Belgium, but through the dense, supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, a region the French believed would act as a natural barrier. It did not. German tanks burst through the Ardennes with terrifying speed, crossing the River Meuse and racing toward the English Channel. The Allies, caught completely off guard, had committed their best troops to the north. Now those troops were in danger of being surrounded. The German strategy had worked perfectly. They had split the Allied forces in two. Panic spread. Communication broke down. Town after town fell. France, one of the great military powers of Europe, was unraveling. In the north, British and French forces fell back toward the coast. In a matter of days, hundreds of thousands of soldiers found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port town of Dunkirk. The sea was at their backs. The Germans closed in from all sides. But then, something unexpected happened. Hitler ordered his tanks to halt. For reasons still debated, whether it was overconfidence, concern about muddy terrain, or a desire to give the Luftwaffe a chance to finish the job, the German armoured divisions paused for several crucial days. That pause saved the British Army. From May 26th to June 4th, 1940, a miracle unfolded. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, saw hundreds of naval vessels, warships, fishing boats, merchant steamers, even private yachts, cross the English Channel again and again to rescue the stranded soldiers. The skies above were a battlefield, with British and German aircraft dueling for control. Bombs fell, ships were sunk, but through courage, chaos, and determination, over 330,000 Allied troops were rescued. It was not a victory, but it was a deliverance. Britain had preserved its army, and with it, the hope of resistance. But France would not be so lucky. As the Dunkirk evacuation ended, German forces resumed their advance. Paris was declared an open city to spare it from destruction, and on June 14th, German troops marched in. The French government fled, and on June 22nd, an armistice was signed. France, once triumphant in the First World War, was now defeated and divided. The northern half was occupied by German forces. The southern half became Vichy France, a nominally independent state, but one that collaborated with the Nazi regime. The speed and totality of the German victory stunned the world. Hitler had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in less than a year. Nazi banners flew over half of Europe. The swastika shadow stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pyrenees. Britain now stood alone. And yet, across the English Channel, a different spirit stirred. Britain, led by its new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, would not sue for peace. The time for appeasement was over. Churchill, with his gravel voice and iron resolve, rallied the British people. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but also victory, whatever the cost. The German threat loomed large, but Britain did not falter. The Battle of France had ended. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. In Germany, confidence surged. Hitler believed Britain would soon come to terms. He admired the British Empire and saw them as natural allies. But Churchill had no interest in negotiation. For the British people, the war had become existential. Nazi domination of the continent was not just a political disaster, it was a moral one. The fight now was not merely for land or prestige, but for civilization itself. As summer came to Europe in 1940, bombs would soon fall on London, but the people there would not bow. The second act of the war was about to begin, one fought not on open fields, but in the skies above cities, in the hearts of ordinary people, and in the unshaken belief that freedom was still worth defending. the battle for Britain and the Atlantic. The summer of 1940 brought with it not the gentle rhythms of peace, but the steady drumbeat of war echoing across the English countryside and deep into the hearts of its people. France had fallen. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, all had succumbed to the sudden and brutal advance of the German Wehrmacht. And now, as the rest of Europe lay under the boot of Nazi occupation, one nation alone stood defiant. Britain, small in size but immense in resolve, became the final bastion of freedom in Western Europe. But Hitler was not finished. He now turned his gaze across the English Channel, determined to bring Britain to its knees. His plan, Operation Sea Lion, was an ambitious one. It called for an amphibious invasion of the British Isles, but such an operation could not succeed unless the Luftwaffe first achieved air superiority. Without dominance in the skies, German transport ships would be easy prey for the Royal Navy. And so, Hitler ordered his air force to begin softening up Britain, to break its defences and morale through overwhelming aerial assault. What followed would become one of the most iconic and decisive campaigns of the entire war, the Battle of Britain. It began in July 1940, quietly at first. German reconnaissance flights probed British air defences, while sporadic bombing runs targeted coastal installations. But the true battle erupted in August. Waves of German bombers, flanked by fighter escorts, crossed the Channel daily to strike at radar stations, airfields, aircraft factories, and ports. The Luftwaffe's aim was not just to destroy planes on the ground, but to crush the infrastructure that kept the Royal Air Force, RAF, flying. Yet Britain was not unprepared. Since before the war, it had invested heavily in a system of integrated air defence that included radar, ground observers, and a command and control network that could direct squadrons to intercept incoming raids. Radar, in particular, proved revolutionary. Known as Chain Home, these early warning stations dotted the coastline and gave Britain a crucial edge. Minutes, sometimes hours of advance notice to get fighters in the air before the enemy arrived. The RAF, though outnumbered, was fiercely effective. Pilots flew multiple missions a day, refueling and rearming between sorties with astonishing speed. Mechanics worked tirelessly, often sleeping in hangars, to patch up damaged planes. Airfields, even after being bombed, were quickly repaired. The Spitfire and Hurricane became household names, symbols of courage and technological prowess. The pilots who flew them, many barely out of their teens, became known as the Few, immortalized by Churchill's stirring words. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Germany believed the RAF would crumble under sustained pressure. For weeks, the Luftwaffe pounded Britain's southeastern airfields, drawing the RAF into a war of attrition. Losses mounted on both sides. Then a shift occurred, one that would change the course of the battle. On August 24th, a group of German bombers, possibly by mistake, dropped bombs on central London. In retaliation, Britain bombed Berlin. Hitler, infuriated that the enemy had dared strike his capital, ordered a change in tactics. The Luftwaffe would now target cities, especially London, in an attempt to terrorize the population and force the government into submission. What followed became known as the Blitz. Beginning in September 1940, German bombers blanketed British cities night after night. London bore the brunt, enduring 57 consecutive nights of bombing. Fires tore through the East End. Churches, homes, schools, nothing was spared. Entire neighbourhoods were flattened. The skies at night glowed red with flame. Yet amid the ruins, Britain did not break. Firemen fought blazes under falling bombs. Hospitals moved underground. Families slept in subway stations and emerged each morning to begin again. The monarchy refused to flee. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in London, visiting bomb sites and comforting survivors. Even Buckingham Palace was hit, but the royal family remained. As cities endured, the RAF regrouped. Free from the constant pressure on their airfields, British fighters struck back with renewed strength. German losses mounted. Bombers, flying deep into hostile territory without adequate fighter escort, were easy targets. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, began to falter. By October, it was clear that Germany had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, then quietly abandoned. Hitler had underestimated British tenacity and the effectiveness of their defence network. The sky over Britain would not fall. But even as the threat of invasion receded, the war was far from over. While the Battle of Britain raged in the skies, another quieter, more relentless conflict unfolded at sea. A battle that would last the entire war and span the vast, frigid waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It was here, in the dark depths and rolling waves, that the fate of Britain's survival would be tested daily. Cut off from continental Europe, Britain depended on overseas supplies, food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials to sustain its people and its war effort. These goods came by sea, in merchant convoys escorted by the Royal Navy. Germany knew that if it could sever these lifelines, Britain might be forced into submission without a single soldier landing on its shores. And so the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, unleashed its deadliest weapon, the U-boat. German submarines prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, coordinated groups that attacked under cover of night. Silent, nearly invisible, and lethal, U-boats torpedoed merchant ships with ruthless efficiency. One by one, vessels vanished beneath the waves, sometimes without a trace. Sailors clung to life rafts in icy waters. Entire convoys were lost in a single night. The toll was staggering. By the end of 1940 alone, over 1,000 Allied ships had been sunk. For British planners, the scale of the crisis was terrifying. If shipping losses continued at the same pace, Britain would starve. Efforts to defend the convoys escalated. Escorts were deployed in greater numbers. Depth charges, underwater explosives, were dropped on suspected submarine locations. But the Atlantic was vast, and U-boats were clever. They changed tactics constantly, adapted to new threats, and developed new technologies. Surface raiders, too, added to the menace. German battleships like the Bismarck and Scharnhorst lurked in distant waters, striking merchant vessels before vanishing into the fog. Despite these dangers, Britain pressed on. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked tirelessly to crack the German naval Enigma code. Intelligence from these efforts, known as Ultra, would eventually prove decisive. But in 1940, the U-boat still held the upper hand. The sea was a graveyard. Meanwhile, in London and across Britain, the war touched every corner of life. Rationing became the norm. Butter, sugar, tea, meat. Everything was measured and precious. Children grew up in a world of gas masks and air raid drills. Nightly blackouts turned cities into ghost towns. Propaganda posters urged vigilance and sacrifice. Keep calm and carry on became not just a slogan, but a way of life. Britain also began to look outward, seeking allies and support. The British Commonwealth rallied to the cause. Troops and supplies came from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. Their contributions were not symbolic. They fought and died on land, sea, and air. Across the oceans, President Roosevelt of the United States, though constrained by American neutrality laws, found ways to help. In September 1940, he agreed to trade destroyers for access to British naval bases in the Western Hemisphere, a deal that strengthened Britain's naval defence and signalled growing American commitment. By the close of 1940, Britain remained under siege, but it was still standing. The Battle of Britain had ended in victory. The Blitz continued, but so did life. The U-boat threat had not been defeated, but it was being fought with growing skill. And in the minds of millions, on both sides of the conflict, a new realization began to take shape. This war would not end quickly. It would not be decided in a single battle. It would demand everything, every ounce of strength, every drop of resolve. The war for the skies had been won, and the war for the seas had just begun. As winter approached, Britain stood in darkness, but not in despair. The island fortress held firm, lit from within by a quiet, determined fire. And across the Atlantic, in towns and cities that still felt distant from war, the echoes of battle grew louder, drawing new nations ever closer to the flames. The Eastern Front ignites. As the sun rose over Europe on the morning of June 22, 1941, few could imagine the scale of destruction that was about to unfold. In the stillness before dawn, more than 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft and artillery, crossed the borders of the Soviet Union in the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, was Adolf Hitler's bold and brutal gamble to conquer the East. He believed that with a single swift stroke, he could obliterate Soviet power, seize vast territories, and gain control over the resources that would fuel his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. But the origins of this catastrophic campaign went back further, beyond tactics and logistics, into ideology and delusion. Hitler had always seen the Soviet Union as both a threat and a prize. To him, communism was a Jewish conspiracy, and the Slavic peoples were considered racially inferior, fit only for servitude or extermination. The conquest of the Soviet Union was not merely a military goal, it was the cornerstone of his vision of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. He imagined vast stretches of land in the east, emptied of their native populations and repopulated by German settlers. Crops would feed the Reich, oil from the Caucasus would fuel its armies, and the Soviet Union, once crushed, would never again pose a threat. For a time, it seemed as though Germany and the Soviet Union were uneasy partners. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 had divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland was split, and the Soviets took the Baltic states and parts of Finland and Romania. But Hitler had never intended that alliance to last. It was a means to an end. As Western Europe fell under German control, Hitler turned his attention to the east. Joseph Stalin, for his part, had received warnings, many of them. British intelligence had passed along reports of German preparations. Soviet spies in Tokyo and Berlin sent urgent messages. Even a German deserter, weeks before the invasion, told Soviet officials exactly when and where the attack would come. But Stalin did not believe them. He feared provocation more than surprise. He had convinced himself that Hitler would not risk a two-front war. And so, in the days and hours before Barbarossa, Soviet forces were unprepared. Troops were on leave. Supplies were not distributed. Airfields were packed with tightly grouped aircraft, vulnerable to the slightest attack. At 3:15 a.m., the illusion shattered. Artillery thundered across a 1,000-mile front. The Luftwaffe bombed airbases, rail yards, and cities. Tanks rolled over rivers and through forests. Wehrmacht infantry flooded into Soviet territory in 3 massive army groups: north, aimed at Leningrad; center, headed for Moscow; and south, bound for Ukraine and the Caucasus beyond. The Soviet military, caught off guard and deeply unprepared, crumbled in the first weeks. Thousands of planes were destroyed on the ground. Entire armies were encircled and annihilated. The German advance was breathtaking in its speed and brutality. But Operation Barbarossa was unlike any other campaign. It was not just a war of conquest, it was a war of annihilation. Behind the front lines came the Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads tasked with rounding up Jews, political commissars, and suspected partisans. In village after village, they executed civilians by the hundreds and thousands. Men, women, and children were forced into forests and ravines, shot, and buried in mass graves. Towns were burned, cultural and religious sites destroyed. It was genocide in motion, preceding the death camps that would later define the Holocaust. For the people of the Soviet Union, the invasion brought terror and confusion. The suddenness of the attack, the speed of the German advance, and the brutality of occupation stunned even the most cynical. Millions were displaced, families were separated, cities were emptied, and yet, from this devastation, resistance began to stir. Civilians formed partisan units in forests and mountains. Soldiers, once retreating, began to regroup. The sheer scale of the attack made it impossible for the Germans to control everything. In the chaos, the Soviet will to fight was not extinguished. It was ignited. In Moscow, Stalin was stunned into silence for nearly a week. His inner circle feared he had suffered a breakdown. But on July 3rd, he addressed the Soviet people in a radio broadcast, calling on them to resist the invader with all their strength. He referred to the Germans not as fascists, but as the enemy, a shift in language that revealed the existential nature of the conflict. The Soviet government declared a great patriotic war. The entire nation was mobilized, men to the front, women to the factories. Entire industries were relocated east of the Ural Mountains to keep them out of German hands. Children worked alongside elders. Peasants dug anti-tank ditches. The Soviet Union, for all its internal repression, proved capable of immense, terrifying endurance. Throughout the summer of 1941, the German advance seemed unstoppable. In the north, Army Group North approached the gates of Leningrad. In the center, German panzers surged toward Moscow, capturing Smolensk and threatening the Soviet capital. In the south, Kiev was surrounded and fell after a massive encirclement, one of the largest in military history. The casualties were appalling. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were killed or captured. Soviet generals, some competent, others merely loyal to Stalin, struggled to coordinate a coherent defense. Yet beneath the surface, the German advance began to slow. The distances were greater than expected. The roads were poor. The supply lines stretched thin. Soviet resistance, though disorganized, was fierce and growing more effective. The scorched earth policy, destroying anything that might be useful to the enemy, left the invaders with little food, few supplies, and no shelter. The initial belief that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks began to fade. And then came the Russian winter. By late October, the skies turned grey, the rains came, and the roads turned to mud. German tanks became bogged down in thick, impassable mire. Vehicles broke down. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers marched through freezing rain in summer uniforms. And still, the order came. Press on. Moscow must fall. It was now a matter of pride and prestige. But the Soviets had fortified the capital. New divisions had arrived from Siberia, fresh, well-equipped, and used to winter combat. These units had been freed up after a non-aggression pact with Japan ensured that the Eastern Front would remain quiet. As temperatures plunged below zero, the Soviets counterattacked. Outside Moscow, the Germans were halted and then pushed back. For the first time in the war, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht had failed. The Eastern Front had changed everything. Hitler had opened a door he could not easily close. The war, once defined by quick conquests and limited goals, had become a vast ideological struggle to the death. The German-Soviet conflict would become the most savage, destructive, and decisive front of the entire war. Millions would die in battles that dwarfed anything seen in the West. Cities would be besieged, starved, and burned. Armies would vanish into snow-covered forests and never return. And yet, the significance of Barbarossa was not only military. It marked the beginning of the Holocaust's most deadly phase. As German forces moved east, their anti-Semitic policies grew ever more violent. In Ukraine and Belarus, entire communities were wiped out. At Babi Yar outside Kiev, over 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days. These massacres, executed by bullets before the death camps began operating at full scale, were the horrifying prelude to industrial genocide. By the end of 1941, the tide of war had shifted. Hitler's dream of a quick victory in the East had collapsed under the weight of Soviet endurance and winter's fury. The German army, once on the cusp of victory, now dug into defensive positions. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, prepared for a long and brutal counteroffensive. And in the West, observers realized that the Eastern Front was not just another campaign, it was the crucible in which the fate of Europe would be decided. The fires of war now burned from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Cities lay in ruins. Fields were soaked in blood. And as the world watched, a conflict of unimaginable scale and savagery had been born. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield. It was a graveyard of armies, a furnace of suffering, and the place where the future of civilization would be fought inch by inch, village by village, life by life. North Africa and the Mediterranean. As war raged across the skies of Britain and deep into the frozen soil of the Soviet Union, another theatre ignited far from the shattered cities of Europe, one that would stretch across the burning sands of North Africa, into the ancient landscapes of the Mediterranean, and through the narrow mountain passes of southern Europe. Here, amid deserts, oases, and coastlines dotted with crumbling fortresses, a different kind of battle would unfold, one of maneuver and endurance, of supply lines and strategy, and of leadership that would shape the legends of World War II. The conflict in North Africa did not begin as a major front, but rather as a consequence of Italy's imperial ambition. In June 1940, shortly after France fell to the Germans, Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, hoping to secure his place at Hitler's side and expand Italian territory across the Mediterranean. The fascist leader dreamed of restoring the glory of ancient Rome, carving out a new empire in North and East Africa. Italy already held Libya, and Mussolini's forces began preparing an advance into British-controlled Egypt. But Italy's war machine was not ready. Ill-equipped, poorly led, and lacking coordination, the Italian army soon found itself overwhelmed by a much smaller but highly mobile British force. In December 1940, British and Commonwealth troops launched Operation Compass, a daring counter-offensive that stunned the world. In just 10 weeks, British forces advanced over 500 miles, captured tens of thousands of Italian soldiers, and seized huge stockpiles of supplies. The British victory was so swift and total that Churchill considered pushing deeper into Libya to eliminate the Italian presence entirely. Alarmed by his allies' humiliating collapse, Hitler decided to intervene. In February 1941, he dispatched a small but elite German expeditionary force to North Africa, led by one of his most brilliant and audacious commanders, General Erwin Rommel. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel was a veteran of the Western Front in World War I and had already earned a reputation for tactical genius during the 1940 campaign in France. Now he would bring his talents to the desert. Rommel's arrival changed everything. Though initially ordered to take a defensive posture, Rommel ignored his instructions and launched a rapid offensive. His forces, collectively known as the Afrika Korps, pushed the British back through Libya, recapturing most of the territory lost during Operation Compass. The seesaw nature of desert warfare quickly became apparent. Wide open terrain allowed for sweeping maneuvers, flanking attacks, and fast retreats. Supply lines became the true lifeblood of any campaign. Victory in the desert was not just about numbers, it was about mobility, cunning, and who could get fuel, water, and ammunition to the front lines fastest. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, North Africa became a dynamic, shifting battlefield. The two sides traded blows in a series of battles across Libya and Egypt, Bardia, Tobruk, Gazala. The fortress town of Tobruk became a symbol of Allied resistance when Australian and British troops held it against repeated German assaults for over 8 months. Rommel's attacks were bold and often successful, but his forces were always stretched thin, constantly fighting against the tyranny of distance and shortage. Every gallon of fuel had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, where British submarines and aircraft hunted Axis supply convoys relentlessly. The British, meanwhile, were bolstered by troops from across the Commonwealth: Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, all fighting under the scorching sun, enduring sandstorms, flies, and extreme heat. Camouflage, dust goggles, and mechanized columns defined desert life. Vehicles broke down frequently. Sand clogged engines. The wounded often waited hours for evacuation. Yet through it all, soldiers on both sides displayed extraordinary resilience. The high-stakes chess match continued into the summer of 1942, when Rommel, after a string of victories, reached the small railway halt of El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria and the Suez Canal. The strategic implications were enormous. If Rommel broke through, he could seize Egypt, threaten the oil-rich Middle East, and potentially link up with German forces advancing from the Caucasus. But here, the tide would begin to turn. Facing Rommel at El Alamein was a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery, a meticulous and disciplined British officer who believed in thorough preparation and overwhelming firepower. Montgomery took command of the British Eighth Army and spent weeks building up strength, reorganizing units, and planning every detail of the counterattack. Morale improved, supplies poured in, reinforcements arrived from Britain and the colonies. For once, the Allies had both the numbers and the plan. On October 23, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began. For 12 days, artillery roared across the desert, and infantry fought inch by inch through minefields and bunkers. Montgomery's strategy was grinding and relentless, designed not for surprise, but for exhaustion. Rommel, suffering from illness and lacking reinforcements, could not hold. On November 4th, he ordered a retreat. The Axis powers were in full withdrawal. Winston Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." But the war in North Africa was not yet over. Even as Rommel pulled back into Tunisia, the Allies launched a new campaign, Operation Torch. On November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa, at Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca. It was the first major Anglo-American amphibious operation of the war, and marked the entry of the United States into the ground war against Nazi Germany. The landings were met with initial resistance by Vichy French troops, but after brief fighting, most surrendered or switched sides. The Americans, many of whom were untested in combat, now found themselves engaged in brutal desert warfare. With Rommel trapped between advancing Allied armies from the west and Montgomery's forces from the east, the Axis position in North Africa became untenable. Fierce fighting erupted in Tunisia as German reinforcements poured in, hoping to hold the line. Battles like Kasserine Pass exposed the inexperience of American troops, but they quickly adapted, learning from costly mistakes. By May 1943, the Allies had encircled the remaining Axis forces. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, the same number captured at Stalingrad. North Africa was now in Allied hands. But the battle for the Mediterranean was not limited to the deserts. It stretched across islands and coastlines, into ancient cities and contested straits. Control of the sea lanes remained vital. The island of Malta, positioned between Sicily and North Africa, endured one of the longest and most sustained sieges of the war. Bombed relentlessly by the Axis and nearly starved into submission, the island held out through sheer grit and determination. Its survival allowed Allied aircraft and submarines to strike at Axis convoys, choking Rommel's supply lines and contributing to his ultimate defeat. With North Africa secured, the Allies turned their eyes northward to Europe itself. In July 1943, they launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Amphibious landings stormed the beaches. The island fell quickly, and with it came political upheaval. In Rome, Mussolini was arrested, and the fascist government collapsed. Italy, weary of war and Axis domination, began secret negotiations with the Allies. By September, Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland. Though Italy formally surrendered, German troops quickly moved in to occupy the country and fortify the terrain. What followed was a slow and brutal campaign up the Italian peninsula, through mountain ranges, rivers, and fortified lines. Towns like Cassino were reduced to rubble. The Allies faced determined German resistance and terrible weather. Progress was slow and costly. Yet even here, in the ruins and mud, a broader truth emerged. The Axis grip on Europe was loosening. From the burning deserts of North Africa to the broken peaks of Italy, the Allies were beginning to punch holes in Hitler's empire. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Axis forces, was now a highway for Allied operations. And so, the battles in North Africa and the Mediterranean became more than military campaigns. They were tests of endurance and ingenuity. They proved that the Axis could be beaten, that the desert sun could not shield tyranny, and that a free Europe would not be won by standing still. It would be earned, foot by foot, battle by battle, across the unforgiving landscapes of two continents. What began as Mussolini's misguided ambition ended as a turning point in the global war. The victory in North Africa gave the Allies a base from which to strike Europe. The fall of Italy opened a new front and drew German resources southward. And across the Allied world, from Cairo to Casablanca, from London to Washington, a new sense of momentum took root. The tide was turning. The road to liberation, though still long and steep, had begun its first ascent. The Pacific War begins. While Europe burned and armies clashed from the deserts of North Africa to the snows of Russia, another front exploded into global consciousness, thousands of miles away, across the vast blue expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Here, in jungles and islands, on battleships and in foxholes, a war of equally colossal scale and ferocity erupted, one that would see empires fall, cities vaporized, and nations forever transformed. This was the Pacific War, and it began not in gradual stages, but with a single, devastating blow. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the skies over the Hawaiian island of Oahu filled with the roar of Japanese aircraft. Waves of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters descended upon the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in a surprise attack that stunned the world. The Japanese aimed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet in one bold strike, hoping to buy time to expand their empire unopposed. In just under 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed, 21 ships were damaged or sunk, and more than 300 aircraft were destroyed or disabled. The attack, brilliantly executed and devastating in its effect, achieved tactical surprise but failed in its ultimate objective. Aircraft carriers, the true capital ships of the future, were not in port. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress in a speech that echoed around the globe. Calling December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, he asked for and received a declaration of war against Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, binding the world into a truly global conflict. The sleeping giant had awakened. What had begun as a war in Europe and Asia now became a struggle that would reach every ocean, every continent, every people. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated act of aggression. It was the opening move of a coordinated campaign of conquest across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Within hours of bombing Hawaii, Japanese forces struck British and American territories throughout the region. They attacked the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Thailand, and Hong Kong. Their objective was clear: seize resources, secure bases, and knock out Western resistance before it could regroup. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were quickly overwhelmed. Despite brave resistance, Japanese forces advanced rapidly. After months of brutal fighting, the defenders of Bataan were forced to surrender in April 1942. What followed was the infamous Bataan Death March, a forced transfer of over 70,000 prisoners of war across more than 60 miles in sweltering heat. Starvation, dehydration, beatings, and executions claimed thousands of lives. The cruelty of the march would come to symbolize the ferocity and inhumanity of the Pacific War. The British suffered similarly devastating losses. In Singapore, long believed to be an impregnable fortress, Over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered to a smaller Japanese force in February 1942, the largest capitulation in British military history. The loss of Singapore shattered the illusion of Western superiority in Asia. Japanese forces, disciplined, experienced, and tactically brilliant, swept through Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and into New Guinea, forming what came to be known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But beneath the surface of this rapid success lay a fatal underestimation of American industrial and military potential. Japan's leaders had hoped that a short, decisive campaign would break American will and force a negotiated peace. They failed to understand the vast capacity of the United States to produce war material on an unprecedented scale, and the determination of its people to see the war through to the bitter end. In April 1942, the United States struck back in a daring and symbolic mission, the Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, flew over Japan and dropped bombs on Tokyo and other cities. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was profound. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been touched by war. The raid shocked Japanese military leaders and led directly to a strategic decision that would alter the course of the conflict. In June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched an ambitious operation aimed at luring the US fleet into a trap and destroying it once and for all. Their target, Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost in the Central Pacific. But American cryptographers, working tirelessly at Pearl Harbor and elsewhere, had broken key elements of the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his staff knew the attack was coming and laid a trap of their own. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to 7th, 1942, would become one of the most decisive naval battles in history. In a stunning reversal, US carrier-based aircraft sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, while losing only one of their own, the USS Yorktown. The victory at Midway shattered the core of Japan's carrier fleet and ended its string of unbroken successes. From that moment forward, Japan would be forced to fight a defensive war, losing ground it had once claimed with ease. Midway marked the turning point, but the war in the Pacific was far from over. What followed was a long, grinding campaign of island hopping, a strategy designed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and capture key islands, one by one, moving ever closer to Japan itself. The terrain was brutal, the conditions inhuman. Soldiers battled not only a determined enemy, but also heat, disease, jungle, and isolation. The first major Allied offensive came in August 1942, on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. Japanese forces had begun building an airfield that would threaten Allied supply routes to Australia. US Marines landed and seized the airfield, but what followed was a 6-month struggle of attrition. Nighttime naval battles turned the waters around the island into Iron Bottom Sound, where dozens of ships were lost. On land, soldiers fought in thick jungle amid constant rain, mud, and fear. Both sides suffered terrible losses, but in February 1943, Japan abandoned the island. It was the first major land victory for the Allies in the Pacific. As the island-hopping campaign progressed, more names etched themselves into the brutal annals of the Pacific War: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte. Each battle was a nightmare of flamethrowers, bunkers, caves, and hand-to-hand combat. The Japanese strategy shifted from aggressive expansion to fierce, almost suicidal defense. Surrender was not an option. Fanatical resistance became the norm. Civilians were sometimes coerced into mass suicide. Kamikaze attacks, pilots deliberately crashing into Allied ships, began to appear, signaling a new level of desperation. In October 1944, General MacArthur fulfilled his famous promise to return to the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought during the liberation of the islands, became the largest naval battle in history. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of sailors clashed across vast distances. The Japanese fleet suffered catastrophic losses and would never again operate as a cohesive force. The Philippines would be liberated, but only after months of harrowing combat, including the Battle of Manila, a fight that left the city in ruins and tens of thousands of civilians dead. While American forces pushed westward across the Pacific, the Chinese front raged on. Japan had been at war with China since 1937, and the conflict there had become a savage quagmire. The Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek struggled to maintain control, while communist guerrillas under Mao Zedong gained strength in the countryside. Japanese occupation was marked by widespread atrocities, most infamously the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. Though the Chinese received some Allied aid, the war in China remained largely a separate and uniquely brutal theatre. By the end of 1944, the Japanese Empire was beginning to shrink. Its perimeter had been broken, its fleet shattered. Its cities, though still untouched, now lay within range of American bombers. The next stage of the war would bring the Allies to Japan's doorstep: Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and ultimately the decisions that would shake the world to its core. But even in 1942 and 1943, the nature of the Pacific War had become painfully clear. It was a war of distances, vast, trackless oceans, where entire fleets vanished beyond the horizon. It was a war of extremes, of suffocating jungle heat, violent tropical storms, and icy mountain winds. It was a war fought on tiny specks of land and on the decks of titanic ships, in skies filled with fire and in seas filled with steel. And it was a war of cultures, where East and West collided not just in military terms, but in deeply rooted beliefs about life, honor, and death. The Pacific War had begun in sudden fury, with the rising sun of Japan blazing triumphantly across Asia. But beneath that triumph lay a rising tide of resistance. The United States and its allies had been caught off guard, but not broken. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, the arc of the conflict had begun to bend. The road to Tokyo would be long, savage, and lined with the bones of the fallen. But it had begun. Turning points. By the dawn of 1943, the Second World War had reached a critical phase. The Axis powers, once advancing triumphantly across continents, were now facing mounting resistance on multiple fronts. In the East, the vastness of the Soviet Union and the harshness of its winter had slowed, then shattered the German invasion. In North Africa, Allied forces had surrounded and defeated the remnants of the once proud Afrika Korps. Across the Pacific, the United States and its allies had halted the Japanese advance and were slowly clawing back territory. Yet the outcome of the war still hung in the balance. The years 1943 and 1944 would become the turning point, the years when the tide, through blood and fire, began to decisively shift against the Axis. On the Eastern Front, the winter of 1942–43 was one of unimaginable suffering and historic consequence. In the shattered city of Stalingrad, German soldiers trapped in frozen rubble faced starvation, disease, and a relentless Soviet siege. For months, the Wehrmacht had poured men and material into a battle that Hitler refused to abandon, and Soviet forces, commanded by General Zhukov and others, encircled the German Sixth Army in a brutal pincer movement. Supplies dwindled, temperatures plunged below freezing, ammunition ran out. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been taken alive. The loss was catastrophic. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological one. Across Europe, people who had once seen the German war machine as unstoppable now saw hope. In Berlin, mourning families received notices of loved ones lost in Russia. Hitler, previously untouchable in the public eye, faced growing doubt from his inner circle. And in the Soviet Union, the Red Army, galvanized by victory, prepared to launch a series of counteroffensives to reclaim lost ground. In July 1943, the largest tank battle in history erupted on the plains of Kursk. Anticipating a German summer offensive, Soviet engineers had turned the region into a fortress, mined, barricaded, and defended with thousands of guns and tanks. The German assault, Operation Citadel, was initially powerful, with elite SS Panzer divisions making deep thrusts into Soviet lines. But they were slowed by terrain, resistance, and pre-planned ambushes. At the height of the battle, more than 6,000 tanks clashed in fields thick with smoke and fire. The Soviets held. They counterattacked. The Germans, drained and demoralized, withdrew. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again take the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. As the Soviets pushed westward, the war in the Mediterranean entered a new phase. With North Africa secured, the Allies looked to strike Europe's soft underbelly. In July 1943, they invaded Sicily, Operation Husky. The assault was massive, involving British, American and Canadian forces supported by hundreds of ships and aircraft. The Axis defense was fierce, but disorganized. German and Italian troops fought delaying actions before retreating to the mainland. The fall of Sicily shook Italy to its core. Mussolini was overthrown by his own government and arrested. Italy soon surrendered, though German forces quickly moved to occupy the country and transform it into a bloody battlefield of mountain passes, fortified lines, and ruined cities. The campaign in Italy was grueling. The terrain favored the defenders, and the Germans, led by General Kesselring, made skillful use of it. At places like Monte Cassino and Anzio, Allied forces fought uphill, through mud and snow, against entrenched enemies. Progress was slow and costly. The Italian front never delivered the quick breakthrough some had hoped, but it succeeded in drawing German troops and resources away from other theatres. Meanwhile, in the air, a new front had opened, one that would bring war to the heart of the German Reich. The Allies launched massive strategic bombing campaigns aimed at crippling German industry, transportation, and morale. American bombers flew by day, precision bombing factories and rail yards. British bombers struck by night, targeting cities in waves. The skies above Germany turned into killing zones, filled with flak, searchlights, and deadly dogfights. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to ashes. Firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. Civilian casualties were enormous. The morality of these campaigns would be debated for decades, but at the time, they were seen as necessary to weaken the German war machine and hasten the end. Back in the West, plans were underway for something unprecedented: the opening of a second front in Western Europe. The United States, now fully mobilized, was producing tanks, ships, and aircraft on a scale unmatched in history. Its armies were growing in number and experience. Britain, battered but defiant, was preparing to strike back at the continent. And across the Channel, millions of enslaved Europeans waited for liberation. The Allies began to gather troops, ships, and equipment in England. Training exercises were carried out. Maps were studied. Codenames whispered. The greatest amphibious assault the world had ever seen was in motion. But before the beaches of Normandy could be stormed, the Atlantic had to be secured. The Battle of the Atlantic, ongoing since the war's earliest days, intensified. German U-boats, once terrorizing Allied shipping, now faced improved sonar, radar, and air patrols. New escort carriers, long-range bombers, and coordinated convoy tactics turned the tide. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who had cracked German naval codes, provided vital intelligence. Slowly but surely, the Allies gained the upper hand. By mid-1943, U-boat losses mounted and wolf packs dwindled. The sea lanes were opening again. In the Pacific, the turning point had already come at Midway, but the long road to Japan was far from over. US forces continued their island-hopping strategy, capturing key positions while bypassing others. In late 1943 and early 1944, brutal battles were fought in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Tarawa, a tiny atoll just a few miles across, cost over 1,000 American lives in 3 days. Each new island brought closer proximity to the Japanese mainland, and with it, increased resistance. While armies fought across land and sea, a different kind of war raged in the shadows. Intelligence operations, resistance movements, and underground networks expanded. In France, partisan groups grew bolder, sabotaging railways, ambushing patrols, gathering intelligence for the Allies. The Special Operations Executive (SOE) supported these groups, dropping supplies and agents behind enemy lines. In Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 showed the world that even amid genocide, resistance lived. Though brutally crushed, the uprising became a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. Back in Germany, opposition to Hitler remained fragmented and dangerous. In July 1944, a group of senior officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his headquarters. The plan failed. The conspirators were executed. Still, it revealed the growing cracks within the Nazi regime. The war, once promised to be short and glorious, had become a prolonged nightmare. Cities were bombed, armies in retreat, and the promise of victory now replaced with fear of total defeat. By the end of 1944, the map of the war had changed dramatically. The Red Army had retaken vast stretches of Soviet territory and was pushing into Eastern Europe. Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states were battlegrounds once again. In the West, the Allies were massing for the liberation of France. In Italy, Rome had fallen in June 1944, the first Axis capital to be taken. In the Pacific, the Marianas had been captured, allowing direct bombing raids on Japan. Tokyo itself was now within reach. The Axis powers were still formidable, still dangerous, but they were on the defensive everywhere. The tide had turned. The Allies, despite suffering and setbacks, were now pressing forward with growing strength and determination. 1943 and 1944 were the years that broke the back of the Axis war effort. They were the years of decision, when the momentum swung, and the long, hard path to victory began in earnest. But the war was not yet over. Hitler still held much of Europe. Japan still clung to its empire. And for the millions of soldiers and civilians still caught in the whirlwind, the worst was yet to come. The end was approaching, but it would arrive only through fire, sacrifice, and the final, most desperate battles of the greatest war humanity had ever known. The end in Europe. By early 1945, the continent of Europe lay in ruins. Great cities that had once been centers of art, culture, and commerce were now shattered husks, their streets filled with rubble, smoke, and silent testimony to 5 years of merciless war. Millions of lives had been lost, and millions more displaced, imprisoned, or enslaved. Yet amid this immense suffering, the momentum of history had begun to shift irreversibly. The once unstoppable German war machine was in full retreat. Its forces, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, were now compressed into a crumbling defensive shell. Allied forces closed in from both east and west. The end was no longer in question, only how long it would take, and at what cost. The opening of 1944 had seen the Allies preparing for what would become the largest amphibious assault in history, the liberation of Western Europe. The long-planned invasion of France, Operation Overlord, was months in the making. In Britain, a massive logistical effort brought together more than 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and trucks, and a vast fleet of ships and landing craft. Spies, resistance fighters, and codebreakers fed vital intelligence to planners. Dummy armies were created to fool the Germans. German commanders, particularly Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, knew an invasion was coming, but they didn't know where or when. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies struck. Just after midnight, paratroopers from Britain and the United States landed behind enemy lines, seizing bridges and disrupting German communications. At dawn, thousands of landing craft approached the beaches of Normandy. American forces stormed Utah and Omaha beaches. British troops landed at Gold and Sword. Canadians took Juneau. The landings met heavy resistance, especially at Omaha Beach, where American troops faced withering machine gun fire and struggled to cross open sand. But by day's end, the beachheads were secure. Operation Overlord had begun. The liberation of France would not be easy. The bocage country of Normandy, dense with hedgerows and narrow roads, favoured the defenders. German forces, especially elite SS Panzer divisions, counterattacked furiously. The fighting was brutal and slow. Towns like Caen and Saint-Lô were reduced to ruins. Yet Allied forces, supported by overwhelming air superiority and a continuous supply of reinforcements and equipment, pressed forward. Breakout came in late July with Operation Cobra, which shattered German lines and allowed US forces under General George S. Patton to sweep rapidly across France. As the Allies advanced, Paris, long under Nazi occupation, prepared to rise. On August 19th, the French resistance launched an uprising. Street fighting erupted. German General Dietrich von Choltitz, defying Hitler's orders to destroy the city, surrendered. On August 25th, Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc entered the capital. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, walked through the Arc de Triomphe to the cheers of the liberated. The City of Lights was free again. Elsewhere in France, Allied forces moved eastward. Ports were opened, railways repaired. German forces, disorganized and retreating, fought desperate rearguard actions. Yet the war was far from over. The Allies would still have to cross the Rhine and push into Germany itself. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet juggernaut was gathering unstoppable momentum. Since the great battles of Kursk and Stalingrad, the Red Army had driven the Wehrmacht steadily westward. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, was a massive Soviet offensive that annihilated the German Army Group Center. In just a few weeks, the Soviets liberated Belarus, parts of Poland, and pushed toward the borders of East Prussia. Towns and villages left behind were little more than smoking ruins. Civilian suffering was immense. As Soviet troops advanced, they uncovered evidence of the Nazi occupation's full horror: mass graves, burnt synagogues, empty ghettos. By late 1944, the Red Army had reached the Vistula River and prepared for the final push into German territory. But as the Soviets advanced, complex political tensions began to surface. In Warsaw, the Polish Home Army launched an uprising in August 1944, hoping to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. They fought valiantly, without sufficient support, and for 63 days held off superior German forces. But the Soviets, just across the river, did not intervene. The uprising was crushed. The city was razed. Over 200,000 civilians were killed. Stalin's intentions were becoming clear. He planned not only to defeat Nazi Germany, but to shape the post-war map of Europe. Back in the West, the final German counteroffensive was about to unfold. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, a desperate gamble known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a massive offensive, involving over 200,000 German troops and thousands of tanks. The goal was to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. In bitter cold and snow, the Germans achieved initial success, encircling US troops in places like Bastogne. But the Allies held. General Patton redirected his army with astonishing speed, breaking the siege. After weeks of fierce fighting, the German advance was halted and pushed back. It was Hitler's last major offensive in the West, and it had failed. With the Ardennes repelled and the Soviets about to launch a final offensive, Germany's situation became hopeless. In March 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The bridge at Remagen was captured intact, providing a critical crossing point. US and British armies poured into Western Germany. Cities like Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg fell. In the air, Allied bombers continued to pound German infrastructure and industry. Berlin was the final prize. The Soviets began their assault on Berlin in April 1945. The fighting was apocalyptic, house-to-house combat, artillery that shattered buildings into dust, civilians caught between the collapse of one tyranny and the arrival of another. The German military, now relying on old men and teenage boys, was spent. But Hitler would not surrender. In his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the dictator issued orders disconnected from reality, raged at his generals, and clung to a fantasy of deliverance. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Adolf Hitler took his own life alongside Eva Braun, his companion and newlywed bride. His dream of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. On May 2nd, Berlin fell. On May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied forces in Reims. The next day, May 8th, the surrender was ratified in Berlin before Soviet representatives. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was declared. Across the world, bells rang and tears flowed. In London, crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square, singing, cheering, and embracing strangers. In Paris, people danced in the streets. In New York, confetti rained from buildings as people paused their lives to celebrate the end of tyranny. Yet joy was tempered by grief. For every name shouted in triumph, there were others that would never return. The price of victory was almost unimaginable. Tens of millions were dead. Europe's Jewish population had been reduced by 2/3 in a genocide that defied comprehension. Cities were gutted, economies shattered. The survivors bore wounds, visible and hidden, that would last a lifetime. And even as Europe rejoiced, the war was not over. In the Pacific, Japan still fought on. Its cities had not yet burned. Its emperor had not yet bowed. And while the guns had fallen silent in Europe, new weapons were being prepared, ones that would alter the nature of war and of humanity itself, forever. But for now, in May 1945, Europe breathed. The darkness that had begun with a march into Poland had finally lifted. The flags of freedom flew once more across a battered continent, and the long, slow work of rebuilding, of healing, could begin. The end in the Pacific. Even as victory was declared in Europe in May 1945, the war in the Pacific raged on with undiminished fury. Unlike in Germany, where cities lay in ruins and the leadership had finally collapsed, Japan continued to resist with unwavering determination. The Japanese military, indoctrinated with a code of honor that revered death in service of the emperor, refused to surrender, and the nation's leaders saw defeat as a shame greater than annihilation. For the United States and its allies, the war in the Pacific was far from over. The road to Tokyo was paved with fire, blood, and an escalating series of battles that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and tested the moral limits of modern warfare. Following the victories in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in 1944, the Allies had gained a strategic foothold that placed the Japanese home islands within range of long-range B-29 bombers. From newly constructed airfields, US bombers began to strike at the Japanese mainland. At first, these raids aimed for precision, targeting industrial centers and military facilities. But Japan's defenses, weather, terrain, and effective fighter resistance made these attacks difficult. And so, under pressure to hasten the end of the war, the strategy shifted toward large-scale firebombing campaigns designed to destroy not just military targets, but the industrial and urban fabric of the Japanese war effort. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the US launched a firebombing raid on Tokyo, codenamed Operation Meeting House. Over 300 B-29 bombers dropped thousands of incendiary bombs across the densely populated districts of the city. The results were catastrophic. The wooden homes and buildings of Tokyo erupted in flames. Firestorms engulfed entire neighborhoods. More than 100,000 people were killed in a single night. Burned, suffocated, or crushed beneath collapsed structures. The smell of ash and death choked the air for days. It was the most destructive bombing raid in human history up to that point, exceeding even the atomic bombings that would follow. Other cities suffered similar fates: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Over 60 Japanese cities were bombed in the months that followed, with hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. Yet Japan did not surrender. The nation braced for invasion, mobilizing its population for a final apocalyptic defense. Schools closed. Civilians trained with bamboo spears. Kamikaze pilots were prepared to give their lives in suicide missions to halt the Allied advance. As the bombing campaign intensified, Allied ground forces continued their brutal march across the Pacific. The next major objective was the island of Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Its value lay in its airfields, which could be used to escort bombers and rescue downed crews. On February 19, 1945, the US Marine Corps landed on the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. They were met with a wall of fire. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress of bunkers, caves, and hidden artillery. Rather than defending the beaches directly, they allowed the Americans to land before unleashing a coordinated defense. The battle became a grueling, inch-by-inch struggle. Soldiers fought underground, through tunnels and pillboxes, with flamethrowers and grenades. The terrain was treacherous, the enemy invisible and fanatical. After 5 weeks of some of the most intense combat of the war, the island was declared secured. Nearly 7,000 American Marines had died. Over 20,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison, numbering more than 21,000, was virtually annihilated. Only a few hundred were taken alive. The iconic image of the American flag being raised atop Mount Suribachi was captured during the battle, a symbol of determination, but also a testament to the terrible cost of victory. But Iwo Jima was only a prelude. The next and final stepping stone was Okinawa, an island just 350 miles from Japan's southernmost tip. It would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. On April 1st, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, expecting a repeat of the Iwo Jima nightmare. Initially, they met little resistance, but soon the battle became a storm of horror. The Japanese had chosen to defend from inland positions. They lured the Americans into the island's interior, where fortified ridges and caves turned every advance into a slaughter. The weather was terrible. Rain turned the hills to mud, fouling weapons and trapping vehicles. The Japanese launched massive kamikaze attacks against the US fleet. Over 1,500 suicide missions damaged or sank dozens of ships, killing thousands of sailors. On land, the Japanese fought with a tenacity that defied logic. They used every natural feature as a weapon: caves, cliffs, forests. Whole units refused to surrender. Civilians, often coerced or misled, jumped to their deaths from cliffs, believing that the Americans would torture them. Okinawa descended into a place of madness. By the time the island was finally secured in June 1945, over 12,000 Americans had been killed and more than 36,000 wounded. Japanese military losses exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties may have reached as high as 150,000. The cost of Okinawa stunned American planners. If Japan resisted like this on its home islands, the invasion could claim millions of lives, both Allied and Japanese. And so, behind closed doors, a different kind of weapon was being prepared. In the deserts of New Mexico, under the codename the Manhattan Project, the United States had developed the most powerful weapon ever conceived: the atomic bomb. Scientists like Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi had harnessed the power of nuclear fission. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the Trinity explosion. A blinding flash, a column of fire, a mushroom cloud towering into the sky, mankind had entered a new and terrifying age. At the Potsdam Conference later that month, Allied leaders issued an ultimatum to Japan: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan, still under the rule of Emperor Hirohito and a war council divided between surrender and total resistance, did not respond. On August 6, 1945, the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In seconds, a city of over 300,000 people was incinerated. A fireball hotter than the sun vaporized buildings, people, and everything in its path. Shockwaves flattened miles of the city. Tens of thousands died instantly. Thousands more succumbed to burns and radiation in the hours, days, and weeks that followed. Still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki. Another flash of unimaginable destruction. Another city reduced to ash. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria. In just days, they overran Japanese forces that had held the region for years. At last, facing annihilation from the skies and invasion from both east and west, the Japanese government moved towards surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people in a radio broadcast, the first time they had ever heard his voice. He announced Japan's unconditional surrender, citing the new and most cruel bomb as a reason. The war was over. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the formal instrument of surrender before representatives of the Allied powers. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony. With solemnity and silence, the deadliest conflict in human history came to an end. But peace did not come easily. The Pacific had been a graveyard of empires and a crucible of suffering. Over 100 million people had been drawn into its flames. Entire cities were gone. Nations had been reshaped. Lives, civilian and soldier alike, were destroyed by the unrelenting violence of a war that had known no limits. The atomic bomb had opened the door to a new world, one filled with possibility, but also with the looming shadow of annihilation. In the months and years that followed, the Allies occupied Japan and began the arduous task of rebuilding. War crimes tribunals were held. The emperor, spared prosecution, remained as a symbol of unity. A new constitution was drafted. Japan, once a fierce militarist power, would become a peaceful democracy. Across Asia, colonial empires would unravel. New nations would rise. Old rivalries would smolder into new conflicts. But for those who fought, who suffered, who lived through the fire and the darkness, the memory of the Pacific War would never fade. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, from the jungles of New Guinea to the ruined cities of Japan, the Pacific War was not just a campaign, it was a crucible in which the 20th century was forged, a conflict whose reverberations would echo for generations. Aftermath and legacy. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world stood amid the ashes of a war unlike any it had known before. In 6 catastrophic years, World War II had engulfed more than 60 nations, consumed over 70 million lives, and shattered continents. The battles had ended, but the trauma, the wreckage, and the moral reckoning had only begun. The war's aftermath would shape the fate of nations and the contours of global history for the rest of the century and beyond. This final chapter was not about combat, it was about what comes after. Justice, judgment, reconstruction, memory, and the hard questions that arise when the smoke clears. In Europe, the scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, Dresden, Rotterdam, and Stalingrad had been reduced to smouldering ruins. Transportation networks were in pieces. Power grids were destroyed. Entire regions had no food, no water, no shelter. Millions of civilians, displaced from their homes, fleeing violence, or liberated from camps, now wandered a devastated landscape, searching for family, for safety, for hope. Refugee camps swelled with survivors. Disease and starvation threatened those who had already endured the unthinkable. There were children with no parents, towns with no men left to return, villages with no buildings still standing. Europe had to be rebuilt from the ground up, but first it had to bury its dead. Amid this shattered continent, the truth of the Holocaust emerged in full horror. As Allied troops liberated Nazi concentration and extermination camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, they found skeletal prisoners, piles of corpses, gas chambers, and crematoria still warm from their final monstrous work. Survivors whispered stories that sounded unbelievable, too grotesque to be real, until the evidence spoke for itself. 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered, along with millions of others: Roma, disabled people, Poles, Soviet POWs, homosexuals, political dissidents. It was not a side effect of war. It was its own machinery of genocide, planned and executed by a modern state. The world was forced to ask, how had this happened? How had an entire nation, educated, cultured, and civilized, allowed such evil to unfold? How could such crimes be answered? The answer, in part, came in the form of justice. In November 1945, in the German city of Nuremberg, the victorious Allies began a series of trials to hold Nazi leaders accountable. The Nuremberg trials, as they became known, were unprecedented. For the first time in history, individuals, not just states, were tried for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. High-ranking Nazi officials, generals, propagandists, and industrialists stood before an international tribunal. The world heard in chilling detail the inner workings of the Nazi regime. Some were sentenced to death, others to prison. But the legacy of Nuremberg extended far beyond its verdicts. It established a legal precedent that the international community would carry forward into the post-war world. Elsewhere, justice took darker forms. In Eastern Europe, liberated by the Soviet Union, vengeance was often swift and brutal. Collaborators were executed. Ethnic Germans were expelled en masse from countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Millions were uprooted, many perished. The lines of victim and perpetrator blurred in the chaos of retribution. As borders shifted and ideologies hardened, the seeds of future conflict were sown. In Japan, the process of reckoning was equally complex. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often called the Tokyo Trials, began in 1946 and prosecuted major Japanese leaders for war crimes. Evidence of atrocities in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands shocked the public. The rape of Nanjing, the Bataan Death March, medical experiments by Unit 731, all came under scrutiny. Some were executed, others imprisoned. But Emperor Hirohito, despite his role as a symbol of Japan's imperial aggression, was spared prosecution, a political decision meant to preserve order during the American-led occupation. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the occupation of Japan became one of the most ambitious nation-rebuilding efforts in history. Japan's military was dismantled, its empire dissolved, and a new constitution, drafted with American guidance, was enacted in 1947. It renounced war as a sovereign right. Women were granted the right to vote. Land reforms redistributed property. War industries were transformed into peaceful ones. In time, Japan would emerge as a democratic, prosperous nation, but it would carry the scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of lost honor and deep cultural trauma for generations. In the United States, victory was tempered by profound transformation. The war had ended the Great Depression. Factories had roared to life. Women had entered the workforce in record numbers. Black Americans, who had served with valor abroad, returned to a country still divided by segregation. The war planted seeds of social change that would blossom in the civil rights movement of the decades to follow. Politically, the US emerged as one of two global superpowers, economically dominant, militarily unmatched, and now the guardian of the atomic age. In the Soviet Union, the cost of victory had been staggering. More than 20 million people, soldiers and civilians, had died. Entire cities had been erased. Yet Joseph Stalin emerged stronger than ever. Under his rule, Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain. Communist regimes were installed in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, and beyond. The promises of post-war cooperation between East and West began to crumble almost immediately, giving rise to the Cold War, a new kind of conflict, fought with spies, propaganda, and nuclear brinkmanship. The map of the world changed dramatically after the war. Colonial empires that had seemed eternal were suddenly fragile. The war had exposed the contradictions of European imperialism. How could nations preach freedom while maintaining control over millions across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East? Decolonization movements gained strength. India would achieve independence from Britain in 1947. Indonesia would break from Dutch rule. Vietnam, Algeria, Kenya. Everywhere, the global south began to rise, often in violent struggle. New institutions were born from the wreckage of war. The United Nations, founded in 1945, aimed to succeed where the League of Nations had failed. It sought to provide a platform for dialogue, a mechanism for peacekeeping, and a declaration of universal human rights. The Bretton Woods Conference laid the groundwork for the modern global financial system. NATO and the Warsaw Pact would soon follow, dividing the world into spheres of influence, both armed and ideologically opposed. Yet amid the diplomacy and rebuilding, memory persisted. Holocaust survivors, scattered and traumatized, began to speak, to write, to rebuild lives in new lands. Israel was founded in 1948, in part as a homeland for Jews who had nowhere else to go. War memorials rose in every country. Graves spread across Europe and the Pacific. Literature, film, and testimony began to shape how the war would be remembered, and how future generations would understand its horrors. For the children who grew up after the war, the world was split between before and after. Before, there had been empires, fascism, ideologies of supremacy. After, there was something more fragile, more watchful. The mushroom cloud hung like a shadow over the future. Technology had reached a point where it could destroy all it touched. The victory of 1945 had come at a cost so immense that it redefined the very concept of war. And yet, from that devastation, humanity did not collapse. It endured. Survivors rebuilt homes, cities, families. Nations, once bitter enemies, became partners in trade, in science, in peace. Former battlefields became memorials. Soldiers who had once faced each other with rifles later met with handshakes. The legacy of World War II was not only one of destruction, it was also a lesson written in fire, a warning carved into the heart of the 20th century. The world had burned, and from the ashes it rose again, not whole, not unscarred, but wiser, more vigilant, and more determined never to let the flames rise so high again. The end. And now the journey comes to an end, not with fanfare or finality, but with a quiet sigh, like a candle slowly flickering low, like the final notes of a lullaby fading into the hush of night. You've walked through years of history, gently, without urgency, and now all that remains is stillness. Let it settle around you. Let it wrap you in something warm and slow and safe. You've witnessed the world in its greatest turmoil, seen the chaos, the heartbreak, the perseverance, and the rebuilding, and somehow, through it all, you remained still and steady, a quiet observer beneath the vast sky of memory. There is no need to hold on to the weight of the story now. It served its purpose, and it's okay to let it go, to allow the names and dates, the places and faces, to softly blur like a painting seen through closing eyes. You don't need to carry the timelines or the echoes of speeches, or the thunder of footsteps across distant battlefields. That noise has long passed, and in its place is only the quiet, the deep and restful quiet that comes after something heavy has lifted. Feel the world around you dim just a little, like the lights of a once busy city now asleep under the stars. You are no longer walking forward or backward. You're floating now, drifting gently. The voices have softened. The images have slowed. The world turns without needing anything more from you tonight. You've honored the past simply by being present for its telling, and now the present, this moment, right here, is yours alone. There is no more story to follow, no more questions to ask, no more thoughts that need solving or sorting. Let them all loosen like threads unwinding, like leaves floating free in an evening breeze. Your breath is slower now, your body heavier in the best way. Your hands no longer need to hold anything. Your jaw can soften. Your mind can drift. You are already somewhere between waking and sleep, and nothing is calling you back. There are no alarms, no responsibilities, no distant drums. Just this, a long, gentle exhale after a deep and patient experience. The war is over, not just in the story, but here, within you too. The tension has left your shoulders, the weight of thinking, of understanding, of listening. It's all been laid down. You are allowed to rest. Not because the day is done, but because you are done. You've done enough. You've learned enough. You've traveled enough. Even without moving, you've crossed oceans and decades. And now, your body knows it's time to be still. Let the room become part of your sleep. Let the quiet sounds around you, maybe the hum of air, the softness of distant streetlights, the familiar silence of night, become the lullaby your body responds to. Each breath you take is a step further down into rest, into warmth, into the softness that's been waiting for you at the end of this story. There is no need to fight sleep, no need to try. It is already arriving. It's in your arms, your back, your fingertips. It's pulling you gently like the tide, carrying you away from all the thoughts of war and memory, of noise and narrative. All of that can stay behind now. It was never meant to be held forever. Just long enough to understand, just long enough to feel. And you've done that. Fully. Beautifully. If any thoughts come now, let them pass like clouds. If any memories remain, let them become distant stars, present but far, quiet, fading. Your only task now is to rest, to breathe slowly, to sink deeper, to fall. There is nothing more to see, no more to hear, no more to know. Just the slow descent into sleep, like a ship sailing into a still harbour after a long, long voyage. You are safe. You are steady. You are quiet now. And as the last whispers of the world recede into silence, as the rhythm of the story gives way to the rhythm of your breath, let the peace that was so longed for in history now become your own. Let it settle in your chest, soft and true. Let it carry you to dreams not of war, but of calm waters and open skies. There is nothing left to do. Just be, just rest, just sleep. Good night. Sleep deeply, sleep gently, sleep well.